Welcome to Saltwater Reasonings. I am delighted to be in conversation with Professor Patricia Mohammed, whose scholarship has helped shape how many of us think about gender, culture, and feminist thought in the Caribbean. This reasoning begins with a simple yet profound truth. Gender is not an add-on to how we understand society. It is a way of reading power, tracing erasure, reconstructing knowledge, and making sense of the worlds we inherit and the futures we are trying to build. In this conversation, we move through Professor Mohammed's intellectual and political formation, from the energy of the 1970s, feminist readings, Black Power, Marxist organizing, and institutional labor, to the long struggle to establish gender as a serious analytical space for Caribbean scholarship. We also talk about visual culture, fair, legitimacy, and what remains unfinished in the project of feminist transformation. This is a deeply grounded and generous reasoning, one that reminds us that gender is a method, a lens, and what Professor Mohammed calls a quiet revolution. Caribbean feminist thought emerged in classrooms but in kitchens. It emerged in the midst of political meetings, in the archives and movements for independence, and just in the quiet insistence that women's lives are not peripheral to history, but central to it. And when I think about your work, that is one of the things that resonates with me. So I want to begin here and arrive at that place and welcome you.
Thank you very much for having me and for inviting me. It is an honor to be part of this Saltwater Reasonings. I like the name.
Yeah. Throughout the global south, we have a relationship with the ocean that brought the diaspora into being as it is today. So it feels really fitting. So I want to start by inviting you to reflect on a moment when you began thinking about gender as a scholarly and as a political question. I'm curious about what was happening around you when you started to really think about gender.
That would take me back to the 1970s. And I have to begin by saying the early roots of feminism for me probably started in my high school days. I went to Naprima Girls High School. And when you go to a girls' school, especially a progressive girls' school, you begin to be exposed to things in a way that you take for granted, but you only connect later on. And one of them might have been the way our school principals never got married, but they were women that we looked up to, like Beulah Magu, and progressive in the way that they would force you to read literature, expose you to ideas. But beyond that, I would have been growing up at the time of my sixth form, flower power. Imagine the flower power days, where you began to have these images on television of women in the US and elsewhere. The whole kind of the women's liberation Bernie Bra movement. And while you were young, you began to connect it. And I think I connected that in my head to the 1970s, the Black Power movement, which also happened while I was in sixth form. I remember there were some women who were involved. And so those connections started to be made. By the time I got to university in the 70s, early 70s, I would have been doing my undergraduate degree from 1973 to 1976. I started to also, at that time, you had Diana Mahabir, and Hazel. So it was not only a foreign thing. There were women here who you could connect to. Stephanie Daly had already done that book, the Legal Status of Women. Stephanie Daly's book was very important. In fact, that we must recall that is a very significant starter to us in the Caribbean and in Trinidad in particular, that legal framework that we began to look at, the Succession Acts, all those things. Things connect. I find it is difficult to have one thread. There are many different connections that have been made. And so by about 79, I joined a Marxist left group because I was doing sociology. And in those days, Marxism was the still progressive thought. it still is in many ways. I mean, that critical thinking that comes with Marxism. But I had joined a Trotskyist group, and there were all these texts we were reading, and around that time you had all these books coming out, too, like Sheila Robotham's Woman's Consciousness, Man's World, which is really very important to all of us, I think, or Juliet Mitchell's Women's Estate. If you think of all the books of that period, German Grace, the female eunuch, all of those are, and Betty Friedan and the feminine mystique, all of those were our reading material. So, but these women didn't write as if they were writing top down. They were writing to all of us. If you go back through those books were actually written for everyone, and they drew you in. I remember meeting Sheila Robotham in the late 80s when I was in the Netherlands doing my PhD, and she was in a seminar I was in. I spoke to her during the break or something, and I said how much her book had influenced me sitting in Trinidad. She was so pleased. She said, that's the reason why I write. So, and she wanted to meet me after, and I was so foolish. I had some other engagement, which I should have just canceled and gone out. That was something I missed. But I'm going back to that moment of awakening, that by the time I was doing my master's, I was doing it in sociology, MSc in sociology. And I had to choose a topic. And of course, by that time, that's in the late 70s, my topic was women and education in Trinidad and Tobago. And I wanted to look at how the policies in education had freed women from the 19th century onwards to enter that space that I was now occupying, which is the University of the West Indies. And that became, in fact, it is probably still one of the first master's theses that was a solid, it was a huge documents we wrote in those days that was done on women. The theoretical space that I used in crafting it, despite the fact that it was on policy and so on, I used Virginia Woolf's A Room of One's Own and created that notion that education was the thing that provided women with the room of one's own and gave us that kind of relative autonomy that we needed to push forward. So if I'm answering your question, all of those things came together, but they came together with the personal experience as well. So you might have all these intellectual, conscious, politically conscious movement, etc. But you also have the personal. And the personal was in two ways. One, I'd grown up in an Islamic household, not dreadfully fundamentalist. I mean, it allowed many freedoms. So it wasn't like a very close, but it was still Islamic. And so there'd be this schism between growing up at home where you had that kind of freedom and then going to the mosque with all these separations. And I think that used to gall me. That kind of the space that women occupied. And the second thing is I saw and I experienced the levels of violence against women, because that idea of violence against women has always been pivotal. And I'll probably come back to that in our discussion. It has always been pivotal and still is in the question of dealing with the status of women and the feminist issues that we deal with. And I think that first-hand experience of violence, and I don't want to go into it because they're too personal to me, but they were certainly like neighbors across the road, in my own household, different aspects of it. And you begin to reject it. You reject it categorically, and something in your head tells you that you don't have to put up with this. I don't know what tells you that. And all of these came together. So by the late 70s, when I was doing my master's thesis, that would have been the first actual study that I did.
I hear the convergence of so many things. When I think about that time and what I imagine was the energy of the time, and I'm hearing you call names like Diana Mahathir Wyatt, I'm hearing that woman was speaking. And what struck me is when you said that the scholarship was pitched in an academic way, but it was pitched in a reasoning. Let's reason about this. And just the convergence of that and all of the personal things that are happening in, the independence movements, Black Power movements, socialism. I'm smiling when I'm thinking about you in Marxist circles. Was it clear where gender fit in the struggle? Was that clear? Was that welcomed? Was it contested? And how so?
Yeah, that's a really nice question because it in those struggles in that time. Say, let me take the Marxist space for instance.
Mhm.
Women were welcome because they always wanted to enrich the um the community of adherents, but um I don't think that women were seen. Remember Stokely Carmichael's line, which is really funny, but interesting one, that the best place for women in the movement was prone. You don't remember that line? Interesting line. Yeah, it was kind of women were partners. We were partners to all the men. But it wasn't that it didn't take us seriously. In fact, I find that growing up in Trinidad is a very contradictory space in the sense that, and I've always been grateful for that men, even while appearing to diminish you or needing to maybe take a patriarchal stance or whatever, they are very aware of your presence and what you bring to something, and they're willing to harness that. So I think that position of women was contradictory in that you were still not really seen as the main leaders of movements, but you were seen as important. But I must say that it was that Marxist group I was in, which was called the Workers' Revolutionary League. It was a serious movement. It was a lot of study. So this is where, you read Trotsky's Third Revolution. You would have already been going through Marx and Lenin and Rosa Luxemburg. But you began to have leadership in it because what they did is they decided, and this is why Sheila Robotham was so important too. She had pointed out the same parallel. They decided they needed a woman's arm. And the Concerned Women for Progress became the women's arm of that group. Even though its roots were socialist, it didn't develop as a socialist, feminist space. Again, things were more watery and slippery and allowed for many different aspects. It was culturally more possible to shape something that suited the space and time. And some of the women were university educated, some were working in trade unions, some were clerks. We didn't have too many working class women, but we did have some. So it was a very nice mixture. And again, going back to your point, and I want to reinforce that point that you made. You said you felt the mood, the notions of sisterhood were real. It wasn't that you liked every woman, because remember, when you meet a bunch of people, you're going to like some people more than others, and this one will drive you up the wall and whatever. It wasn't that it was all love and togetherness, but it was a sense that you were all building something together, and there was a sisterhood, a real sense of sisterhood, and a real sense of trying to be to change mindsets. It was not an elitist group at all. The Concerned Women for Progress is very much based on embracing a lot of difference.
That's reassuring to hear. As a feminist thinker, it's good to hear that and to commit to that energy. Your work is also insisting upon gender as an analytical category in Caribbean scholarship, and that must require institutional change. That notion that you just touched on, the idea that growing up in Trinidad and Tobago in that space, and I think it still is, it could sometimes be contradictory where there is that patriarchal arm, but there's also making room for women. And I think about the institutional courage that that kind of work takes in that UWI space in the 1970s. What did that insistence cost you? Did it cost you something? What did it open?
The thing is, it cost, in an ultimate sense, it cost you a reputation of being a scholar who had taken an easy way out. It was as if people saw gender as something that was not really a discipline, not really something you should study. They didn't understand the logic of it. They didn't understand the politics of it. They didn't understand the theoretical components of it. And they certainly didn't understand what it was trying to do with practice. And because everybody has a gender, not an agenda, but they do have an agenda
Some
too.
of them have an agenda as well.
But it was because everybody thinks they are male or female or whatever in between. As we know, we allow for many, and so they think, well, okay, by virtue of having that experience, my bodily experience of gender, therefore I know.
Yes.
And so there's a sense of that gender isn't something you can, in fact, teach or learn about more or craft as a discipline or
Yes.
develop as an analytical tool for understanding how society works and functions. Now, in a sense, my committed analytically had to do with the fact that I had been through a fairly complex understanding of Marxism and class. And growing up in Trinidad, I think we have such a nuanced understanding of race. And then you tie that in with the civil rights movements, which again, I forgot to say is a major impact.
It's happening, yes.
Yes, at the time. So that if you layered and gender, and then you saw the parallel. So every time one of these concepts emerged and had taken over the world, just think of how class became an issue. You had the whole Industrial Revolution, socialist Marxism. That took centuries to create and understand of what class differences meant and how class was privilege and how class reproduced a class system. Same for caste. And the whole race issue that is still ongoing, but that also had to take its own path. So when you add a gender to that, and you realize that some of the Marxists were saying you are just whittling down our struggle because the importance is class. There were many papers written about what is more important, class or feminism or the feminist movement, and they belittled it. In race, if you think about the issues of civil rights and others, it was where do women stand? You should not fracture this by saying your gender calls for specific analysis. So bringing gender into the fray, apart from not seeing it as complex and needing to be analytically pursued and studied, it was also seen as watering down. The next point is that to those who began to understand it and to those who began to recognize what it was doing, which is empowering women's voices, it was fair, and therefore they already started to react to it. One of the reactions, of course, a basic one, is if you don't understand someone, you don't want it, you just belittle it enough. So you're getting all of these kinds of competing things. But I have to end on one note. Again, that moment, if I can describe the moment of growing up in the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, when all of this is coming into fruition. It was a very heady moment in society, both ours and globally. Think of all the Vietnam War. We still had a very functioning UN, human rights. We didn't have the kind of leaders we had now. We had some progressive leaders. And Trinidad had Eric Williams, and in his own way, he was very empowering to our society and, access to education, his embrace of women. I think what it did is you went into things with both an optimism, no fear, and a don't care attitude. you really didn't you didn't think you had to look over your shoulder, and that might be also personal to me. I think when I'm focused on something, I get not obsessed. It's not an obsession. Obsession means that you locate it irrationally and you deal with it irrationally. It isn't that, but you are convinced by logic, rational, empirical data, experience, and intuition that this is a right path and that what you are doing is something that is important to follow through. And so that liberates, that frees you as well. So I don't think I ever really took on the business of people denying you or thinking that I'm less than. I still get it, It hasn't gone away. I still get it, but it hasn't shifted me. I mean, it might be an irritation and a bother at times, but
It feels as though the institutional courage becomes what you have to do. And the fallout that happens as a result of it is, in a real way, not your business
well,
because you're really married by this.
yes. And the other thing is there was a critical mass of women and men. We had some really very solid men within the academy too, who were so supportive that there was enough of a groundswell that there was a community, and movements grow within communities or supportive communities. And I think the institutional growth had that support. And then we were getting support in the Caribbean and at the University of the West Indies from the Dutch. My earliest groundings, of course, was the fact that because of the Concerned Women for Progress, because of my socialist leaning, because of the way I was involved in activism, as well as doing a master's, I was given a Commonwealth Fellowship Award that was actually advertised globally to work with Professor Kate Young at Sussex for 1 year to set up the first women, men, and gender study course. It was a 3-month course. And that was in 1984. And so I spent a year with her developing that at Sussex, which is a very progressive space. The 3-month study course brought together women, and I think there were about 2 men. There's about 30 participants from all over the world. It was a vicarious knowledge and traveling in gender. So those kinds of experiences outfit you, if you like, for not just the Caribbean experience, but for the global connections. And so by the time I was here, institutional building, there were many allies, not just in the Caribbean, but abroad.
Yeah, we speak about race and gender, but I also wonder about the colonial archive that's also part of that building. Do you think that Caribbean feminism is still struggling for legitimacy? Fast forward to 2026. Do you think that it's being seen as this fundamental tool for social life? What is your sense of the movement from then to now?
Can I be very honest? I think that that moment when we were institutional building from 1982, when we started the early women and development studies groups, and then by 93, when we were the first Center for Gender and Development Studies was formed, when the pioneers, Elsa Leorini, Barbara Bailey, myself, Rhoda Reddock, Eugene Barito, all of us were part of those early heads and coordinators. I think that movement into the next decade, that building movement, was far more consolidated, and even with its problems, it was far more optimistic and focused about what had to be done. It built also, we have to remember, since references are important, on Jocelyn Messiah's Women in the Caribbean project, which had started from 1999 to 1982. And I was part of that project as well. It was a moment when we didn't have data. We didn't have the research. We didn't have the theoretical tools. We didn't have conceptual tools. We didn't have methodological tools how to study the Caribbean. And all of these PhD theses that we did, all of the, like what Rhoda did with women and labor, mine in gender negotiations among Indians, and Eudine's on the economy. The amount of work that the Women in Caribbean Project showed up, all of this gave a space for academic opening up into disciplines as well. The new discipline, literature took it on, and so on. So there was a way in which within the academy, there was a goal. We had to produce the material. Now, I think the question that you're asking needs to be pivoted around two angles. One, that within the academy, you have the business of teaching, research, producing empirical data, theoretical knowledge, and so on. But the way the institutes and the centers were built, it was that we had to connect a practice and an activism. And I think in those days, we also attempted to do that. We did it in a very fundamental way. We had connections with everybody who was doing anything you had to connect to. Women's groups, national bureaus. We were very connected to bureaus and national bureaus. So you're connected to the state as well. My sense of, and I've left the academy for a while, and even for years I was in a lot of different kind of administration as director of graduate studies. So I lost some of the closeness to it. But I wonder if that early moment of how we defined ourselves and our goal, I wonder if in the current period, 2026, that has actually been redefined for this period. I think where is the focus or the foci? We don't need to have one. And I know the staff are all working. It isn't that they're not working. But that kind of consolidated way we came together through a series of disciplinary and interdisciplinary seminars, huge ways of bringing people together to process thought. I don't know if we have engaged sufficiently again like that in the academy to process those ideas again and to see where they are now. And maybe that is what needs to be done.
Yeah, in UWI, the Institutes of Gender and Development Studies have always had this commitment with community. We talk about building an activist university, and I feel like as though there are ways in which I still see this fight for legitimacy. And when I look back at the history, I wonder, why are we still fighting for legitimacy?
Well, I think we should ponder on that a little bit more because, if I may, fight for legitimacy, in fact, is not going to end. I don't think it is a win-win kind of end, because if you look at how departments in gender studies are closing and women's studies have closed down in other parts of the world, the fact that we still have ours is actually a victory. But the legitimacy of it is still not really understood. You say we are asking for activist university. The universities have changed, as we know. They've changed considerably and tremendously. And how does gender prove itself as a space to train professionals, which is what a lot of disciplines do, or to produce scientific knowledge, or to produce science, or to produce engineers? Because of the nature of the discipline, it doesn't produce a kind of individual that is easy to put your finger on. But a very interesting thing happened to me only recently, which is that I was invited to be a director on the board of the Republic Financial Holdings Limited. And I'm not going to elaborate on it because you're not supposed to talk about stuff on the board. But what was interesting is that I asked, what is my reason for being on the board? And they said that the area of diversity, equity, and inclusion is important. and that the body of my work demonstrates that for them. So it's a nice way of seeing how gender comes home to roost in a way. That they don't just see it as add women and still, but they see gender, or they root through gender into equity and inclusivity and diversity as part of that package that the gender is trying to deal with. And I think those are small victories, but they are indications which we should look at where our gender people move to. A study that maybe we haven't done sufficiently yet. How have all these graduates fitted into various niches in society where they bring great value?
Mhm, mhm. I'm sitting with that. I'm also thinking in your work, you've made the distinction between gender equality being accepted and being managed. And you've argued that we've done one better than the other. You're beginning to speak about that gap and thinking through about what breaks that gap down. I wonder, when we think about structures and institutions and how they absorb the ideas of gender, and they don't necessarily always transform it, but they absorb it. And I wonder about that gap and what needs to happen so that we can have not just absorption, but also transformation. I'm hearing a little bit about it when you talk about the work on the board, about figuring out where our graduates are and what they are doing. What do you think we need to do to continue to narrow that gap?
Let's go back to your point about gender equality being accepted. And what we have done is manage it. I think that is something that has eluded a lot of people, by the way, because the notion that women, when you see a lot of women in directorships, in boards, in leading government, and whatever, you assume that women have made it. Fine. So the assumption of gender equality is both in terms of reality. I think we have to accept that we have come a long way, baby, as Virginia Slims would have said years ago. We have. I think to deny that in the space of just over a century, think of when Mary Wollstonecraft wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Women, to know how much has changed. And that means the feminist movement has actually accelerated a certain kind of mental shift. Certainly among a large portion of the population, we know that there are people who fundamentally still believe that women's place is in the home, barefoot and pregnant, right? Let's ignore that group and assume that the rest of the world, many people understand. So that I think that has been understood. The management of it, for me, has to do with the management in two ways. One, the management in the household, because we forget how important households are. The division of labor in the household, the gender division of labor in the household, that then informs how people think in the workplace and how they can accept. And the other one is at the managerial level, the executive level, where real decisions are made and the acceptance of that. I look at the various areas I'm functioning now and work with and so on. And I feel that there's a real attempt to embrace gender. It's no longer just a concession. For me, it's no longer, oh, we must humor the women and keep them on our side. I think we've gone past that. I really do think so. I think we have to accept that as a plus. But the management of it is still to see where the pockets that women are still not fully liberated, or that they are not maybe making inroads, or that people's choices to do certain things are still not understood. So for me, I never wanted that management of equality to then create this imbalance between the woman who stays home and decides she wants to be a housewife and look after her children, or the man for that matter, and the one who goes out to work because they need to have two incomes, which most people do know. I think we need to understand that placing that kind of dilemma for women and is creating another burden that we really shouldn't do. So there's a way in which that management for me needs to take place at different levels and understood at different levels.
I think women are definitely more visible, and that visibility doesn't always translate to decision-making power. You said something earlier too. You talked about the fact that for a lot of people, because we are all gendered beings, we feel like, I know this. And sometimes I feel that tension in the academy with people who haven't studied gender. There's this sense of, but I am a gendered being as well. It is clear that some of them have never sat down and read gender theory. But I am a man, I'm living in a man's body. I am seeing things happening between male and female students. And there's a way now I could step in here and be an expert. And so that's a tension that I'm seeing. So when I thought about the question around acceptance and how that has not necessarily translated into respect for gender as an area of theorizing.
The thing is, gender has suffered the most because it is not a quote unquote discipline. If you think of most disciplines, I mean, sociology, they'd have a series of theories. It is about the study of society. They might have branches of sociology, but they all link back to some common goal that Durkheim and Comte and others started off with. So there's a thread that they go back to, right? So a discipline is formed with a core understanding of what it is. From the time gender came in, it was not really a discipline. It was interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary and even transdisciplinary. And I talked about it being seen as watery. The fact that people could not locate the core of what gender is. And for them, that core is simply that women are an oppressed group and men are the oppressors. And therefore it is about power and privilege. And it became a battle. It was both the theoretical, the conceptual, and the political for them. And in a sense, that kernel hasn't changed, It has not really changed. So when we talk about gender as analytical tool, we look at the biology. We go back to the basics of biology, X and Y chromosomes, how boys' brains develop, how girls' brains develop, how they learn differently in education. We look at the area of division of labor. And you could start that again from the house. So who is taught to do what? Who learns what skills? Who learns to be the nurturer? Who learns to be the protector and gatherer? Then we go to other disciplines. We look at economics, again, division of labor, science, everything. You go back to different roots and gender requires you always. And I have brought visual and imagery into it as well. Gender goes back to so many roots that explains this space in which to understand gendered behavior, gendered expectations, gendered attitudes, and so on. It is complex, layered, and it requires study. But most people don't understand that or do not want to appreciate that that is another area of knowledge. The most important thing about gender that has been difficult to grasp, and I myself, I keep repeating it because I know it is true, but gender is also the reconstruction of knowledge. It is constantly reconstructing knowledge. So it's taking past knowledge and is saying how we read this in the past has not been correct. The only way we can move to some direction of change is to reread it, which is what Black Studies has been about too, and by the way. So you take the business of the hunter-gatherer. All women were the gatherers and men were the hunters in anthropology. And it turns out that for centuries, the anthropologists and whoever said the hunters were most important because they brought the protein and the meat for the tribe to survive. Without that, they wouldn't. The skins to keep them warm. But then later, feminist anthropologists Sally Slocum and others pointed out, without the domestication of animals, without the figuring out which grains, without the weaving of baskets for storage, methods to cook and store and preserve and whatnot, the tribe would still not have survived. And how do you weigh that as equal? Where I'm going with this is that it requires us to reconstruct bodies of knowledge. History is another one. The fact that it was thought that only great men made history. But you look in history and see the amount of women who were part and parcel of that making of history, whether it was in the little acts they did or the large ones where they led armies. All of it means reconstructing history. So the battle of the discipline is really that battle of creating a profound understanding of how gender is not just about the changing of mindsets and so on, but within the academy, the reshaping of disciplines. The other disciplines haven't really taken that on. Sociology hasn't really said, okay, we need to make sure that our sociology students all understand a basic gender paradigm so that they can infuse that into how they think about whether it's child studies or community studies or whatever. Scientists need to understand how we have to think differently about the knowledge of the ovary and the sperm and how Aristotle created that first hierarchy. Women are emotion, men are reason. They didn't have that knowledge then. So if you're recreating knowledge now, you're recreating with different bases. So the whole of philosophy needs to be rethought and reshaped. That is very, very fundamental work that the academies haven't done. It isn't that it hasn't been started. There's lots of work around it, but it hasn't come together as a major resource that will inform a future if we get the chance to have a future.
And it feels like life sciences work as well.
Gender is the quiet revolution. It is not the revolution where you can take guns and make change. It is a quiet revolution, so it's going to take many centuries. But you ask in 2026, what are we doing? It is whether or not we fundamentally understand that apart from the activist work we do within the academy, that kind of work needs to be done as well. And it has to be appreciated and understand what that work looks like and how you train your new doctoral students that they are building on this. They are all developing components of it.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Woo! I want to shift a little bit to your visual work, because your work moves between academic essays, historical archive, and visual film imagery representation. What do you see that feminist analysis could do in visual culture that it cannot do on a written page? What does visual make more alive? And how is image sometimes able to hold an argument in a way that it can't be held in a written word?
I think the different people have different ways of absorbing knowledge and information, data, and even how that shapes their imagination and how that shapes the language of their communication. And I think visuality and the visual was always something that I knew about myself from the time I was young. Because when I was even in primary school, I'd already started drawing and making sculpture and painting. And my happiest moments, I have to thank my father for that too, because he was a painter. He had learned, he'd been exposed to painting in teachers training college through MP Aladdin, one of our artists here. And so he introduced me and I took to it like a duck to water. So, but beyond that, if you think about yourself taking a journey, let's take a metaphoric journey. You drive on a road and you're doing, you're going to somewhere new that you've never been. Some people look at signposts and remember the signposts. Some people might look at the shape of the land or whatever. I don't know what other people look at. Some people might look at the rum shops, and my memory was always image. I would find back things through the image. I could just go back and say, yes, you need to go there. The road makes a curve there. There's a tree there. Is what, there's always that kind of way. And I knew that visual memory got nurtured in many ways, but also it was a natural thing. I would do painting competitions, and next thing you know, I'd win, bicycle and all sorts of things. So it's kind of, it took it for granted, basically.
Yeah.
And I, once I won a little camera in one of these things, and I was taking photographs from very young. So the photographic memory, but it goes back to something else that is even more primeval. And you made the point about how the image holds an argument. I like that term very well, that way of phrasing it. I think because we are moved emotively by the visual in a way that language cannot always move us. I'm not saying it doesn't, because it does. But every time you use language, the spoken language, implicit in that language is an image. We think with thought images, and we speak with those thought images, even in our mind as we speak. And so we are translating, and the visual image is more direct. And it translates it quicker. It stores in our retina. I think it processes through our visual sensory sensors, and we hold that. Now, unfortunately, in today's current digital world, we are fed with so many false images, competing images, inured with images, that we've lost something. We have to now go through a path that I have called for years since I wrote Image in the Caribbean, called visual intelligence and discernment. We are now in that route. If you think about the work that Noah Yuval Harari does a lot when he's talking and taking people through things, he's constantly processing you through that intelligence that you must go through. And I think visuality is about that. So let's take the point about visual intelligence and why I came to it too. You said, we talked about how everybody has a gender, and people think because they experience gender, well, they know gender. The same thing applies to the visual, People think because I have an eye, I could say, well, I like this and I don't like this, and I don't have to learn how my thought process, what has lodged itself in my memory and my retina and my brain to make me think this way about an image. They don't think we have to learn that.
Mm-hmm.
So my move into the visual was to be able to capture three things. First, you could recapture gender in history, because a lot of images where people painted or even took photographs, they were men and women, boys and girls, and you could begin to read the image. However controversial images, you can still begin to read. You see market women, you see, slave women, you see different classes. You can read the images. You can read a lot from material culture. So the image was one way of capturing what was lost in history that you could still find that wasn't written in the text. But the second part of the visual was to be able to create a language that was unashamedly emotive. Because if you had to change opinions and ideas, then you had to be able to tell a story where you showed the nuances of what gender is. So to give you an example, I made the film Coolie Pink and Green, which still has become a classic, being repeated all the time. But there's a scene in it when the girl questions what choice should I make between the arranged marriage that the parents are making and her choice. And you can show both. The visual allows you to show her processing that thought and making an argument more convincing and emotively. and get an understanding of that. I think the visual does that. I just saw a film of the book by Orhan Pamuk, The Museum of Innocence, on Netflix. 9-ish episodes. Very interesting. That is one of the most amazing books about a man's emotions that you could not convey without, even the book doesn't do that for me. The film did it. It shows you this young man who then lives out a life with this innocence about what love and lust and commitment is. Tragic in the end for him, but the visual tells stories. So I use gender within this. But my love of the visual goes beyond that, which is to embrace everything. I mean, the way we look at landscape, the way, in fact, my sense of visual works with with the part of philosophy that deals with aesthetics, in which the word ethics is there. And it has to do with how we, in our mind's eye and in our brain, we construct notions of beauty, morality, truth, good, bad, ugly. Our eyes do that in no time at all. Why? We look at something, we say, this is beautiful, this is not, this is, and it is a processing through our eyes, and that is where our ethics comes from as well, or ethical behavior. So all of this is combined in a way. And I've studied painters to see what they have made of it, because it is painters who do that for us. They look at it and they construct narratives for us as well.
My stretch into visual has been a lot about giving myself permission in the academy to not be apologetic about emotion and to not try and be objective, because visual data is just rich with emotion. And that idea that a limbic system, which is a very big part of how we make sense of the world, it speaks in sensation, image, and sound. It doesn't speak in words. So that focus on the new frontal cortex, I need to analyze and be cognitive. To me, visual data forces us to rely on the parts of our brain that speak in that language. And then I find it fascinating because there's so much data there that escapes a lot of the cerebral or cognitive or written word work that we do. So I think about it especially in trying to articulate Caribbean ways of knowing. So we can put some more space between our ways of intellectualizing our existence, put some space between those new Euro-American Western ways and tap into the visuals that have always existed and the data that's already there. I also feel it almost like an ancestral download. I feel like data allows us to access things, memories that have been passed down, or ways in which our experiences have shaped how we see and interpret the world. There's so much to unpack this. When I think about imaging the Caribbean and your work in visual, it was that marriage of the visual work, but bringing that into conversation with our epistemology and how we know what we know as Caribbean people grounded in this space.
You've described where Imaging the Caribbean came out from, because I thought I wanted to vicariously travel through history, visually, and claim the Caribbean. And Imaging the Caribbean is that. It is about saying, okay, this is how this space evolved from a visual point of view. The language was a visual. But I want to come back to another point you made, and you talked about the cortex, and I'm never very good at scientifically explaining things. Sorry, my brain just doesn't work with me. But one of the things that we keep forgetting is that as human beings, we think that evolution happened long ago, and we evolved. We are evolving all the time. And I think the production of all of this digital space that we have, all of the digital tools we use, and we won't list them, but they're all there around us. like a second limb. All of this is forcing us to evolve in a way that the visual is going to be vastly more important. It will evolve, our evolution is going to take that path for me. And how that happens, we can't begin to understand it yet. We haven't, studied, but I think that's part of our evolution. It has to be. And how
Yeah.
that connects, that creates different synapses in the brain. So if our language centers are more connected now, how our visual centers are reshaping themselves.
I think that's why I think it's so important for us to go there. And you're speaking to just how things are changing with visual cultures. When we start doing research with people, in order for us to escape some of the ways in which algorithms are shaping what we pay attention to, I think when we start to do research, it's going to become more important to give participants cameras, to ask for people to look at the materials that they have inherited and try and make meaning out of that as a way to ensure that we are owning how we are visualizing the world.
Well,
So important.
I'm absolutely fascinated with those algorithms now. I mean, they
Yeah.
they're amazing the way it's like a troll that pushes you in a particular direction, whether or not you wanted to go. And then you find yourself almost apathetically going along the road and then catching yourself.
Yeah.
It is amazing. It's a whole new world that has opened up before our eyes, literally
I
before our
think
eyes.
so. So when I started this podcast, I have an Instagram account, but when I started this podcast, I started one for Saltwater Reasonings. The visuals and that algorithm is so different from what shows up in my Tracie Rogers profile. And I marvel at the things that this connects me to. So the algorithm, just by the nature of what this podcast is, it's curating for me. And
Yes.
I am always astounded by how different that curation is from what is curating for Tracie Rogers. Although Tracie Rogers and Saltwater Reasonings, they're run by the same person, but it looks like a totally different person. You wouldn't think that these two people are going
Yeah.
through life the same way.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm fascinated by how the algorithms seem to think it knows you.
And I
Yeah.
feel it's also trying to convince you that it knows you. So much so that now we can't question what it is we think we know that we know.
Yeah.
Um, I also feel that the visual culture, it makes it Hmm, let me put it this way. So we've been talking about gender around the binaries, but we also have a history of non-binary that has always existed. And so sometimes when I hear some of the pushback from certain quarters about what gender is coming to now and what it means to be non-binary, but the visual culture also tells us that this has always existed. So it's almost like this, as you said, the history is there, and it
Mm.
reminds us of who we are, um, and it helps us to confront algorithms or structures telling us who we are.
The whole business about the binary and binary thought, you're thinking, has always been part of my thinking about gender. I've always, everything I write, I constantly am working with that binary, breaking it down, but also, in a sense, coming back to it. Because there's something about the tension that binary creates that is actually built in how gender has to be constructed, in the concept of difference, and how the binary, male and female, reproduction requires that notion of difference and the coming together of difference in many ways. Now, of course, we interrupt that binary by saying, we could reproduce and we could create test tube, in vitro fertilization. People could have surrogate parents. But the fact is that demographically, that binary keeps the sexes intact in a sense that what communicates itself in the attraction pull between masculinity and femininity, male and female, into reproduction. And what drives that hormone, and how does that set up a necessary binary? I have not convinced myself that that is necessarily the way the future will be. But I think to date, that is how people think, that if people fear this expansion of our LGBTI space, they fear the extinction of a human race, or at least a reduction of it, if that doesn't remain as almost God-given, to use their word. That's why I think that that binary in gender is so problematic to it. It is both problematic, but it's also understandable for me in a way.
The tensions always exist. It drives, even in non-binary spaces, there's that tension. I think those two axes are just
Yeah.
driving the work, always does. But and you speak to the fear, which I think a lot of times I hear in spaces when gender is brought up.
Yeah.
There is immense fear. And I don't know if it's fear about what would this do to me? What would I lose? And what do I now have to fight for? And we don't name the fear, but the fear is there. And the fear, I feel, drives so much of the energy.
Of course, we didn't call the elephant in the room. That is what it is. When we talk about gender, why you get these funny looks on people's faces, the kind of half smile, whatever. A lot of it is based on the fact that they think gender is about creating a race of lesbian women who want nothing to do with men, or even effeminizing men to the extent that they no longer see themselves as these masculine stereotypes, that once they've lost the power to the notion of being the breadwinner, then they'll have no role. I mean, all of these things are very real fears that people have, and how feminism has dealt with that. There are camps. So we have people who defend, people who try to mediate, people who then take a strong position. But there's such a difficulty in getting across to people that the complexity of gender itself and the fact that these are being discussed and aired is important to understanding that concept of equality and diversity and inclusivity. Because when you confront that and you discuss it and you concede to the fact that some people do not choose their sexuality, biologically they framed in a particular, then you don't come to it with these kind of negative notions. So to understand that and to understand and sympathize and to empathize with the choices that people make or have to make, all of that is about understanding difference, diversity, inclusivity. That is part of the message of gender, I think. If you think about it, what other discourse raises all those things in such a finite way so that it touches the thing that is closest to us, our family, our, our children, and gender goes into the homes, it goes into the workplace, it goes where other disciplines don't necessarily always go. And therefore it is threatening, but it's also the most liberating if we were to confront it. And I'm coming back to that fear because I was asked by the government about 2011-12 when Trinidad and Tobago was negotiating its second iteration of the gender policy again to meet with the religious groups. I think we had 2 workshops with them. Huge. They brought out all of them, the entire religious groupings, including Lawyers for Jesus. For me, these 2 workshops were one of the most learning experiences in confronting this business of what people fear about gender. You heard it, and these people spoke openly. We said this is a safe space. We want people to be able to speak. And I was pleased. I mean, people really were honest. And like, for instance, one group said, we understand, we admit we are pastoral to our flock, but we don't want it named. if you do not name it, it does not exist. And so there's methods we've used to not really call things by their names and confront it. And I just found that was interesting compared to the Hindu group who said, well, we have a third sex already, the Hydras, so we've already admitted to it. And so you have all these variations on how religion, which is a bastion, has dealt with it. And you have to listen. You have to listen and understand why people fear. But how do we deal with it? I don't have any solutions, none of us have.
I hear that. Did some work with the Anglican Church, and I remember a bishop calling it disordered affection. And that was interesting to me as well. I'd never heard that term.
Disordered affection.
Yeah. She said there is a term for it. We have named it. It's called disordered affection.
But they still imply a disorder. So they still pathologize it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So I remember that workshop. I learned so much. It was just interesting to actually hear when people speak freely. Let's just understand how you perceive it. And there's so much to learn.
But I think more of those things are more of that kind of reasoning, if you like, which is non-judgmental, but allowing people critical thinking and allowing them to name fears and allowing them to really say what they fear. I don't know whether we've really engaged in that sufficiently, and I think it's important.
I want to ask you what feels unfinished in your work.
It's interesting you ask that because I've moved since I retired in 2019. I completed the biography of Janet Jagan. And it's all 500 and something pages, and it took me 5 years. And I'm now doing a biography of James Isaiah Boodoo, who's an artist in Trinidad. And there's another kind of exploration. One was, political, and I understood politics. And I understood Guyana, which I hadn't before. And one I'm writing about an artist that we need to read, a biography of an artist, which understands not just the chronology of his life, but search for style and subject, his training, his writing, really understand art history and so on. So I'm doing all of that because there are parts of writing that I haven't explored. I no longer feel, I'm answering your question in a negative way, but being positive. I no longer feel the pull of writing for the sake of academic publications. I do, I don't like papers again. Quite like just being able to speak or to write what I think, informed by knowledge, of course, and research, but write it in a different way. I've always attempted to write with that kind of level of communication anyway. What remains unfinished is I've never wanted to write my biography because it's almost like a too indulgent kind of thing. But what I would like to write is something that captures the moment of my living so that in future, somebody reading it could say, oh yeah, this is what it was to be alive at that time. Not just about me, because so much has changed. And why I thought of that as a kind of way of writing was when I was doing my PhD thesis, I came across a book called Montague, which is written for the 13th century, when they used to axe all those people who were not Christians and so on. This was such an amazing history. And I sat down and read this thing. And when I was finished it, I could understand what it was like to live at that period. It threw me back into the 13th century and just understand it so thoroughly. And I felt if I wanted to write another book, it would be tell that story, but not just about me, but generations. It will have parents and other people and other characters, even the characters that I live abroad for a lot of the, and I have a whole life elsewhere, and how all of those become part of a modern condition that we have now, compared to a time when people lived in one village and they might travel to the town, 5 times a year, if so much. How life had changed. But write it in a way that gave you details and gave you the kind of flavor. Maybe, I shouldn't say it, but maybe because when you say something, sometimes you don't do it, but maybe that's the kind of project I have. And it wouldn't necessarily be in a single book. It might be essays. So that's one of the unfinished things. Tracing how I myself would have found that level of freedom functioning the way I did, as many of the women of my time did.
I hope you write it. If it's a series of essays or a book, I hope you write it. I feel like we need to read it. I hope that makes it happen.
We'll see.
My conversation with Professor Patricia Mohammed leaves me thinking about gender, not simply as a field of study, but as a long, patient, unfinished practice of reconstruction, a way of rereading history, remaking knowledge, asking harder questions about power, fear, difference, and the worlds our institutions are still struggling to imagine. What stayed with me most is Professor Mohammed's description of gender as a quiet revolution, not but the kind that announces itself, but the kind that works slowly, consistently across disciplines, households, archives, classrooms, images, and lives. If this episode moved you, I hope you will share it, sit with it, and return to it. You can find more episodes, writings, and reflections from the listening library at tracierogers.com. Until our next reasoning, take good care.